So in chapter 4, what we kind of want to delve in a little bit more here is what the relationship of the colonies were to England. We've kind of already discussed it a great deal in chapter 3, and that was that mercantilist relationship, where the mercantilist relationship depends on the fact that the New World is basically just used for capturing all the resources, and then you make those that new world dependent on finished goods and the financial infrastructure from the old world. We want to delve into that though further. This is actually a rather short chapter, both in terms of pages and in terms of the AI slides. But it's an important chapter, despite its shortness. It's also important enough. Again, for some weird reason, the chapter 3 AI generated slides drew material from chapter 4. So you're going to see some repetition here, but it actually is not appearing until chapter 4. Um, that's its true place for whatever reason. Okay. I'm just going to skip over the overview and jump into kind of what gives us birth of the colonies themselves. The colonies are born out of this mercantilist idea. The mercantilist idea starts in the 1500s, the Middle Ages, and from that, the idea is that within the old world, that you've got an accumulation of gold and silver and a desire to, as much as possible, develop trade relationships that are lopsided. Lopsided in the sense that they not there not be as much of a concern about getting things as cheap as possible, rather that the idea is to create a trade relationship that keeps the gold and silver within the country, and that the trading partner gives it only minor goods or unfinished goods. Lots of tariffs, lots of trade restrictions, lots of dependencies created between the primary country and the territories or their other trading partners. That pretty well describes the relationship of England to the New World, right? Unfavorable trade balance, tariffs, other things to restrict trade and to create that dependency. And when you hear that, no wonder the colonists were upset with England. This was created by mercantilism. By the Revolutionary War, and certainly after it, mercantilism as an economic philosophy is largely dead. Not only with the emergence of the newly created country of the United States and a democracy, but also what you see is with the fall of the monarchy in France in the late 1700s, and then England losing the War of 1812, mercantilism is largely dead. What mercantilism represented is it represented, right? So you have these monarchies, right, that are creating the laws, which are administering justice, which are fighting the battles. But the economic ideas and the management of the entire economy isn't being done by the monarchy. Rather, it's being done by business people, by industrialists. And they have the influence over the monarchy to get the trade relationships that they want. So it's the business people, the industrialists, and their mercantilist policies that get us the joint stock companies that help us establish the colonies. it's the mercantilists and the business people and the industrialists that, um, again, get a monarchy to use their navy and to use their armies to implement these tariffs and to create these trade regulations. To some extent, right, when you think of the Battle of the Revolutionary War, the British monarchy doesn't really have a heart in it, right? They don't have the spirit of it. It's the business people in England that are going to be losing the money. I mean, yeah, the monarchy doesn't want to probably lose a war, but at the same time, they weren't getting the monarchy on its own wasn't getting a great deal out of it, as much as at least the business people were. But what that means for us too is that the United States, which is emerging and emerges as an independent country, right, after, winning the Revolutionary War, right, and the establishment of Washington as the president in 1789. The big decision that had to be made is what kind of an economy were you going to create, and it wasn't going to be a mercantilist economy, not by any means. In fact, again, at that time, Adam Smith and Wealth of Nations is coming on the scene in 1776, and that's largely a text that spells the end of mercantilism and the encouragement of this idea of comparative advantage. The mercantilists are such an odd group. As someone who has studied extensively the history of economic thought, what becomes difficult for understanding them is that you don't really have any scholars in mercantilist thought, right? This is just business people, again, pushing their thoughts in their own self-interest. They want to achieve power and wealth and for themselves, but also for the country that they represent, and the monarchy is supporting them, right? And again, build trade relations that are really not sustainable for any meaningful amount of time. You get the colonies that are established and supported on the basis of mercantilism, right? The export of the natural resources to the old world, the gold and silver leaving pretty quickly back to the old world, the agricultural goods going back to the old world, and finished goods coming to the new world. That's all mercantilist pushing that. But again, quite exploitative, and we shouldn't be too surprised. As lofty as Thomas Jefferson and the other founding fathers want to be about rights and liberties of humans, I the evidence suggests that most colonists didn't care that much about that. They care a bit, but more so it's having a more meaningful, a more supportive, it's economic system that's not mercantilism. And creating that independence from the new, old world in terms of economics. As representative of mercantilist policies, you get the Navigation Acts, again, which for some weird reason was talked about in the chapter 3 slides, even though it wasn't in that chapter. But what you need when you've got mercantilism is you need trade routes that are getting you that flow of goods, right? The flow of the unfinished goods to the old world and the flow of finished goods back to the new world. And that's what you get the Navigation Act. That the goods are pretty much just going to England, and that the ships are England, British flagged, and British sailors. Not much unlike the Jones Act that we have here in Hawaii today, and I guess that's the mainland being our mercantilist overlords. um, Building on the Navigation Acts of 1660, you would then also get well, I mean, you get the Navigation Acts, but there was an earlier version of it um, back in almost a decade before that. At the time, the British were really worried about the Dutch. You know, the Dutch had their influence certainly in New York City. And so the British did pass in the early 1650s a version of the Navigation Act to just stop things happening on Dutch ships. But in 1660, it was then limiting it exclusively to British ships that things could go on. And then you had in 1663 some revisions made to the Navigation Acts. I'm not sure. Well, yeah. I mean, I'm not sure I would call the Sugar Act and that an extension of the Navigation Acts. That's a little bit extreme, but mm, I say that because the Sugar Act is really just a limit on a good rather than the way in which the good is transported. See, the Admiralty Courts are 1696, the middle of the slide here. That is really an extension of the Navigation Acts because that's kind of giving us the rules and regulations that we're going to use to regulate trade. Right? 1660 Act is just saying how are things actually going to be transported. The Sugar Act is limited to one specific good, and it gives us the taxes on that one specific good. It's a mercantilist policy. I'm just not sure I would classify it as an extension of the Navigation Acts. I don't think, as I'm looking at it, I don't think that the textbook, I'm just looking very quickly as I'm talking here, I don't even think the textbook calls it because if it does, I would have to disagree with it. Yeah, it doesn't either. The textbook also doesn't refer to the Sugar Act as an extension of the Navigation Act. Again, let's just call that an AI mistake. Not surprisingly, because of the Navigation Act and just the general relationships that we have, the colonial trading partners were largely to England. That's the vast majority of the trade that's all going on, with the top exports being the tobacco, bread and flour, rice, fish, wheat, and indigo, and corn. Where's that all coming from? The southern and, to a more limited extent, the middle colonies. And with the exception of the fish. The fish are coming from the northern New England, but for the most part, these trading partners are all primarily through the south and the middle colonies. Which would then explain why the West Indies, which would obviously be pretty close to the southern colonies, both in terms of climate as well as in physical distance. And then even really in Southern Europe, because Southern Europe, what are we talking about here? Spain and Portugal. When we think of, again, if those are the primary goods, for some weird reason, what is not shown to us here, but is shown in the book. So let's go to the book chapter here. I just want to emphasize this here first. I mean, you're seeing this here, right? And again, what I like about what the textbook does is it's got the southern, the middle, and the northern colonies. And what you're seeing here is, again, a largely export-driven um, uh, export-driven uh, structured economy for the New World as a whole. And that, again, for the most part, sending things to England, with all the colonies collectively exporting about half of all a little over half of what they produce to England alone. Another quarter to the West Indies, and then the remainder to Southern Europe. And the imports overwhelmingly coming from England. There's that dependency for you. The other thing, though, and this goes back to what I was saying here, let's split it up again to what's happening in the individual colonies. Right? We can then see, and this is on page, what is this? Page 62. This is a really good description. This comes, this research, although it's a bit old, it's about, I mean, it's just really extensive, and it really, again, gives you a great, this is the reason why I love this textbook, and not love, but like a lot. We have a situation with each other. But the northern colonies, middle colonies, southern colonies, again, get in that mindset. 3 different regions that are different from each other. And you're certainly seeing this here, right? In terms of their dependency on England. That's happening in the South. Look at that, right? That's happening in the South. That's why, again, I'm saying, right, if we wanted to make an alternative history, South would not be fighting England in this case. Economically, that'd be suicide in this case. And again, for New England and the middle colonies, different kinds of goods produced, things not being as important, even just the export industry as a whole. Now, in terms of what they're doing and where the ports are, this also would be where the book is quite useful. So then look at this, right? The problem that we have is that, yes, you've got Charleston, Norfolk, and Baltimore. Those would be the primary ports that the southern and middle colonies are relying on. Not a lot of infrastructure as opposed to the northern colonies. So the northern colonies would be, you have a lot of ports there, but you need that for both the imports and the exports. And again, the scale of the economy is a bit smaller as well. And then the final thing I want to show you here is on page 64. Is that what's cool about this is that we're getting to see who owns the ships. And then looking at who owns the ships, that in terms of things that are going to Great Britain, those ships are primarily, when we talk about going from New England to Great Britain, they're primarily owned by the colonists when things are going to Great Britain. But that would be from when they're from New England. But then look at this. When it's coming from the South, again, primarily British. Again, highlights for you. And if you're not getting a lot from me in this era 1 of the course, what I really hope is that this is dramatically shifting your understanding of the colonies and that you think of it again, South, Middle, North. Very different economic situation for the 3 of them. Okay, let's go back to the slides here. So again, the port towns, again, these are primarily our biggest cities. We don't have, again, outside of Norfolk and Charleston and Baltimore, Everything else in terms of the port towns are all in the northern colonies. Water is going to be the primary way in which we transport everything. We don't have an extensive road system, certainly. Water is going to be our cheapest way of transporting things and our only meaningful way of transporting things. The thing that becomes important to understand here is that the colonies were either trading amongst each other using a barter system, or were having to try to find ways in which to get either credit or currency. The biggest problem by far, the biggest thing limiting the colonies economically was not having a currency that could be used. You need that money not only for the local trade, but obviously you also need it for the exportation and importation of things. Again, you could use forms of commodity money, right? That would be actually using furs, or using actual crops like tobacco, and that would be fine for local trade, what the textbook calls country pay, right? Because as a form of commodity money, it would just be the actual good itself that could also be used. But the big thing limiting the trade again is just the fact that they don't really have a currency. The commodity monies that you have, many of those that I just listed to you, they're either really difficult to move around, or the other issue would be is that things can spoil, they're inconvenient, you don't even really know the quality, right? You want me to pay for bills like dragging big furs around or big barrels of, I don't know, tobacco or whatever? Nah, that's not really not a good way to do it. All of these problems are then augmented even further by the fact that when you're trading with the old world, how are you going to get the credit that you need, right? That's going to be pretty difficult if you really don't have any. How are you going to borrow money if you have no way to repay that debt because you can't even get access to the currency? Um, I actually don't think, yeah, they don't even make a slide about it. So let me just talk about it, I guess. What you're also not getting really until the early 1700s, based on all these problems with the commodity money, is that you then start to see, at least in those port cities, those seaboard cities, um, you see a replacement of the commodity currencies, such as, again, ones that are based on fur and tobacco, not being used as much. And as the economy matures, certainly by the early to mid 1700s, where we're using more gold and silver, and most notably, using more paper currency. That in fact, even though paper currency is invented by the Chinese in like what year 1000 or something like that, the Chinese didn't end up actually using paper currency that much. Instead, what we see is that individual colonies are starting in the mid 1600s to mint their own coins, but they didn't have a lot of bullion, right? They didn't have a lot of silver or gold. It was pretty hard to get to. And so instead, they just start issuing paper currency because then it's just much easier. And so you see, starting in Massachusetts, but then spreading to Rhode Island, Connecticut, right? Those would be three colonies that are relying a great deal on exporting things to England, but then even South Carolina, and that would be really where the economic force is, where those four colonies, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and South Carolina, are all printing their own currencies. The problem is that they're kind of learning how to do it. I mean, really for the entire world, because no one else was using it at all. And they end up, for the most part, printing way too much, getting us some of our early examples of inflation. Um, the textbook states here, what, middle of page 68, a statement that I just want to highlight for you, right here. Absolutely 100% agree with the textbook on this, that a paper currency was the one of the great legacies of the colonists. I mean, it's now the worldwide standard that countries do not rely on bullion and a commodity currency, but rather rely on a fiat currency. The Grubb text, money supply in the British North American colonies. You'll see this in the references. This is actually a really good piece. If you're really interested in, like, if your thing is that you're really interested in like coins and early currencies, look in the references for this Grubb piece. If you can't find it, I'll find you this, if this is kind of like just something you're interested in. That would be this reference right here. Going back to the slides here. Not surprisingly, and I say this because this is the point of mercantilism, is that the British were the ones that exclusively benefited from having these colonies, that the colonies had a large trade deficit with England. So it was not a favorable set of trades. It was imbalanced trade. And that was by design, right? That's the whole reason why England wanted the colonies. So the colonists had trade deficits. And it turned out that these trade deficits were quite unsustainable. So I guess in some sense it's good that we finally had a revolution, because if anything, the trade was so imbalanced. How imbalanced was it? Well, fortunately, again, the textbook can tell us. That trade deficit, as you see, is growing and growing, right? With larger and larger imports. Yes, the exports are growing too, but not nearly at the same pace as the imports. And the trade deficit is getting larger and larger. So this right here, table 4.3 on page 69, that right there is your ticking time bomb. That's leading to the American Revolution. But it's also not a very fair table. Now, unfortunately, I'm not Shepard and Walton. I don't have the data, and I'd be curious to see what it is. But if we were to divide this then by our southern, middle, and northern colony structure, the trade deficit was not equally distributed. That the largest part of the trade deficit was in the northern colonies, and that the smallest trade deficit was in the southern colonies, which again would be why my theory would be is that in this alternative universe, the South is not going to be declaring their independence from England. The trade deficit just wasn't enough to make it concerning. Now, what we see here, right, you get a little bit of a sense here, right, is that again, the trade deficits are much smaller for the lower and upper South than they are for England and the middle colonies, at least in this small time period here between 1768 and 1772. And as you see, for the upper South and lower South as a whole, all countries together, you have a trade surplus rather than a trade deficit. Again, no reason to believe that the southern and middle colonies would have necessarily revolted against England in the way that, well, certainly in the New England, but to a lesser extent, the middle colonies would have revolted. The northern colonies really just have to rely on ships. And that's actually what we see here, which again would be another really useful slide here from the Walton Shepard piece. This Walton and Shepard piece, by the way, just to kind of show you here, the Walton and Shepard piece is a really good, I read it some time ago, but this is kind of a classic. If you think that in this course, the most interesting part for you is going to be the study of the colonies, take a look at this Walton and Shepard piece. Again, the library will have that. And again, it's just it's a really good read, at least for me. Bring back here, when we look at what's all being, what's bringing in the money that can allow us to offset that trade deficit, we're largely talking about shipping, right? That would be one kind of key source of exporting. And then the other would be the British spending money. Money is certainly for defense, and spending that money on in the New World. Go back to the slides, and that's what you kind of see right here. What else do I want to say? Always. Let me make sure. Yeah, I mean, I guess the only other thing I would want to say about this chapter that's at least meaningful to say here would be the other thing to not to kind of erase from your mind from whatever you would have learned in high school history, or maybe even if you took a history class here at UH, would be this notion that the colonies in this dependency relationship were being subsidized by England, and they were not. The British were making the colonies pay their own way for all of these things. Okay. Again, this is a rather short chapter, but what I would have hoped that you would see out of this chapter is this idea that the mercantilist relationship, that's the key way that we can understand the revolution starting to, the seeds being planted for the revolution to occur. And that the height of the trade deficit in the 1750s and 1760s is setting the stage for others to be concerned, but that we wouldn't think that all the colonies would have been equally concerned because they were not all equally faced with a trade deficit with England.